So I wore purple today because it's Roxana's favorite color. And I'll just get started. As I was just saying, I'll be reading for the most part, just because it's easier. And that's the way I organize my presentation. So thanks so much for coming today in this terrible weather. So I'd just like to begin by talking a bit about why I'm here today. So I first encountered Roxana when I took her class, Post-Colonial Relations and Transformative Education, 2 or 3 years ago. And it was actually in this room, so it's kind of fitting. We really hit it off, the two of us, and I asked her to be a part of my thesis committee, which she agreed to do. So as you'll see in my presentation today, my research focuses on migrant worker agency and the embodied experience of work and migration among Canada's migrant farm workers. So if you're at all familiar with Roxana's work, it won't be any kind of surprise that I asked her to be on my committee, and she really provided a really unique perspective and voice because our work intersected in so many different ways. So in today's presentation, I will summarize my main research questions. There are 2. And then I'll briefly discuss what I did in the field. And then I'll give a broad snapshot of where I'm going with my dissertation, which is in the stages of being written right now. So I'm going to start my presentation today with 2 different stories. And they're both intended to demonstrate my own position with regards to my research and some of the key moments that led me to ask the questions that I'm asking. So I'll start with the first story. Sweat and soil caked to Alberto's skin against the wind that flew across the flatbed truck. His one hand clasped against his cap while the other searched for a life-saving grip. His bones vibrated with the shake of the moving vehicle. Alberto and a half dozen or so of his colleagues wrapped themselves precariously around the edge of their employer's truck. They had all just finished a 12-hour shift planting tobacco. Alberto's back was sore. Like everyone else, he was tired. He looked forward to his nightly chat with his wife later that evening, but he dreaded the required 2-hour return bike ride to the nearest payphone. He also wasn't looking forward to the night's restless sleep under the child-sized cot that his Canadian boss was obligated to provide. Alberto thought of the overcrowded bunkhouse, and his aching joints reminded him that he hadn't had a full night's sleep in months. Without thinking, he lay down to rest. Just then, the truck came to a sudden stop, and the driver flew open his door and stumbled to the back of the truck. "You think you're tired?" Alberto's boss yelled. "Let me give you another 4 hours, and then we'll see how tired you are. My Mexicans don't sit on their asses." The boss ordered Jacob, the Mexican Mennonite employee who occupied the passenger seat, to translate. Without hesitation, Alberto responded in Spanish that he didn't care how much he was yelled at, that he would soon be back in Mexico. Jacob refused to translate. No one talks back to the boss, and he was fuming. "You can make the rules once you start signing the checks around here. One more word out of you and I'm sending all of you back." Before struggling back into the driver's seat and speeding away, the boss stared directly into each worker's eyes just long enough so that they each had no choice but to look away. Silence ruled the ride home. No one spoke to Alberto that evening or the entire next day. I'll admit that this has been slightly dramatized for effect, but this is largely a first-person narrative of what happened on that day with Alberto, because I was present with him on the flatbed truck. So during the agricultural seasons of 2003, 4, and 5, I worked as a Frontier College laborer teacher. Now, as a volunteer laborer teacher, my job was to facilitate literacy and ESL classes with my migrant farm worker colleagues from Mexico. I lived in the employer-provided dormitories and worked all of the same hours on the farm as my coworkers. And during this time, I worked on 3 different farms, so in tobacco, tender fruit, and a fruit tree nursery. So during my time as a laborer teacher, I encountered many situations like the one Alberto experienced. So this brings me to my first research question. which is, how is the distribution of workers' bodies maintained and resisted at the level of everyday encounters? So you don't need to remember that word for word. I'll come back to that. So the second story is more recent, and it's intended to reveal some of the tensions of conducting quote-unquote empowerment work, or empowerment-type work, in this particular context. So for the past 6 years, I've worked as the co-artistic director of a small popular education and community arts organization called Informa Theatre. A few years ago, we were approached by a trade union to conduct several popular theatre workshops with migrant farm workers in the town of Leamington, which is home to Canada's greenhouse industry. The union hired us because they were having trouble convincing workers to support the union. So our job was to facilitate consciousness-raising workshops with workers in the area in the hopes that a popular theater blitz within their campaign could help to produce a critically active leadership base that could help the union to shore up support. So as we wanted to ground our workshops in workers' everyday experiences of work, we began by conducting activities that were designed to get workers thinking and talking to each other about their actual lived experiences. So workers began to discuss with each other the problems and issues they face in the workplace. Workers discovered, of course, that they had a lot in common, including feeling pressure from their families to be constantly sending home remittances, and also dealing with worker-to-worker conflict in places like the dormitories and in the workplace. So inevitably, the discussion led toward the role the union could play in bettering workplace conditions. The workshop participants claimed that they were aware of union activity, but pretty much couldn't really, or they had never considered supporting a union, even though they were aware of its existence. So the general feeling was that supporting the union would not do much to address the issues that they felt they were facing at work, including especially the ones that they were discussing in this workshop. And immediately they wanted to move on and talk about something else. They just weren't interested. So it really felt as though inserting the desires of the union to build leadership and sign union cards was somehow an imposition of the process of dialogue that we had begun. So at the same time, I feel like we had sort of begun to unearth a tension between what I considered to be a potentially radical and democratic process of engaging workers in dialogue on the one hand, and imposing the goal of the union on the other. So we presented our final report to the union, and then we were never hired by them again. So I'm really assuming that from their perspective, this is why I'm in grad school, from their perspective, this was not an effective use of their resources, as we had not really reached our goal of convincing workers to take on leadership roles. So meanwhile, the response from the workers was very different. There was a general sense among the participants that by providing a space to discuss common problems in the workplace, the workshops were genuinely addressing issues they wanted to talk about, things like isolation, pent-up frustration, a lot of different things like that. And they wanted to continue the workshops, but obviously we didn't have the resources to do that. So I'm hoping that this story can provide some background to understanding my second research question, which is, in general, what does it mean to engage in decolonizing pedagogy with migrant workers, and in particular, how can the use of a theater-based pedagogy facilitate emancipatory goals? So it'll be important to remember that this is very much a work in progress. So this is the first time I'm presenting on my work in any kind of detail. I'm presented at conferences, but very short snippets of my work. At the moment, I'm writing my thesis. I've completed one chapter, and I'm presently halfway through a second chapter. Hey. So I'll take you on a journey through my dissertation project, and I'll try to touch on the main points of embodiment and learning so as to highlight Roxana's influence. So I originally said that I would be talking specifically about image theater as a kind of qualitative research method. But as I started to work on this presentation, I realized that my brain is a little bit somewhere else right So I'm really working on completing a solid first draft of the first half of my thesis. And this includes the lay of the land chapter, which I've pretty much finished, and also more of a theoretical chapter, which I'm working on now. So that's where I'm at, and that's what I decided to focus on. Now, I did plan on doing, organizing something at the end for a group sort of discussion, but I don't think we really need to do that, but we'll see how it goes. So you may notice that the first half of my presentation is a bit more polished than the second half, and that's because the first half is part that I've already written. It's been vetted by my supervisor. The second half, I'm just literally starting it now. So I'll just give you a brief synopsis of my project and my participants before moving on. So in 1966, Canada entered into a bilateral migrant farm labor agreement with Jamaica. And in that year, 264 Jamaican guest workers came to the province of Ontario to harvest tobacco. So in the years since, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program has really grown significantly. So I'm not going to refer to it like that again because it's way too long. So I'm going to refer to it either as the SAWP or the SAWAP. Sometimes it comes out as one or the other. Just so you know, it's the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. So the program later included several other Caribbean states and British overseas territories, and in 1974 included Mexico, and in 2003 Guatemala. So at present, it's administered by Employment and Social Development Canada, and it's active in 8 out of 10 provinces and not in any of the territories. So Ontario receives the lion's share of migrant farm workers, mostly in the agricultural regions of southwestern Ontario, so Niagara, the Niagara region, Norfolk County, and Essex County. And Essex County is where I did my research. In 2012, there were a total of roughly 40,000 migrant farm workers in Canada, and about half of them were in Ontario. The rest were mostly in British Columbia and Quebec. Now, there have been some changes. I'll just mention this since I've done my field work, and that's there is a new iteration. For those of you who follow migrant worker politics, there has been some changes, and there is an iteration right now of the temporary foreign worker program that's in the low-skilled stream that is specifically geared towards agriculture, which is not a part of the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. Now, these particular workers can be from any country, and it's more sort of employer-driven, and it's not as the government is less sort of involved in the hiring practices. Now, this, yeah.
Does that include? Is it only foreign workers?
Yeah, my work is focused on foreign workers.
The act, like the program, or does that also include sex workers?
I'm not sure about sex workers. I think they are included. They would be included in the low-skilled stream of the new program. Yeah. So I didn't really focus on workers in the new program, mostly because they just didn't exist at the time. So my work is focused more on the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, which is still very active and still relevant. So my research was conducted in the town of Leamington. So that's, for those of you who know Leamington, it's considered Canada's tomato capital. There's a big tomato in town, there's a couple, and it's also home to many industrial-scale hydroponic greenhouse operations. So these are not family farms, right? These are workplaces that have 150, 200 employees, right? They're big operations. The town of Leamington hosts roughly 5,000 SAWP workers every year, so it's a lot. And they come for 6 to 8 months and then return home for 4 to 6 months, depending on their contract. So my fieldwork consisted of 9 theater-based workshops, 30 one-on-one semi-structured interviews, and 1 invitation-only final performance that was designed specifically for a migrant worker audience. So the interviews, workshops, and performances focus on workers' responses to the situations that they face as migrant workers in the program. So why am I approaching a study of migrant workers from an embodied perspective? And what do I mean when I refer to, quote-unquote, the distribution of migrant worker bodies, which I referred to in my first question? So these are questions that I address in my first chapter, so I'll just provide a brief overview. So translated into English from the original Spanish, the title of this section, or this chapter, reads, "We are subjects." I should say my fieldwork was all conducted in Spanish. So Ignacio, one of my research participants, and all the names have been changed, made this statement to me during a conversation we were having about his desire to visit all of the farms on which he has worked in the past 20 years, one last time before retiring for good from the program. With these two words, or three words, "we are subjects," Ignacio expressed in eloquent precision, I think, his 20 years of experience working as a CWAP worker in Canada. In this moment, he was expressing to me that he felt trapped at work and trapped in the bunkhouse, the dormitory. This statement was undoubtedly meant to be read as something like, "Migrant farm workers are placed under the power and control of the state and their employers." Ignacio clearly intended to express dismay at the level of legislated and extrajudicial constraints that he felt impeded his effort to lead a normal and productive life in Canada. On the other hand, his statement could also be understood to point toward the constructed category of migrant worker subject, which is produced and placed within a set of, in the words of Michel Foucault, power relations that are very complex. In this iteration, workers may be seen as themselves players within more or less horizontal fields of power, as benefactors, accommodators, and resistors. So Ignacio's claim that, quote, "we are subjects," could also potentially hint at the phenomenological, collective, and social experience of migrant farm workers as themselves embodied agents. Ignacio's response to his situation may unwittingly reveal what it means to be a captive laborer on the one hand, and on the other, an active negotiator in shaping the global processes within which workers live and work. So this chapter frames the experiences of migrant farm workers in such a way that navigates this complicated territory. So by examining the practices of power and control that permeate the SAWP, in my research I intend to shed light on how these may shape migrant farm workers' embodied experiences of employment and agency. So as is evident in Ignacio's overt intention to highlight migrant farm workers' experiences of limited freedom through their participation in the program, in order to develop an understanding of subjectivity, agency, and embodiment, I think these must be analyzed through the constraints which permeate the program. So the first chapter really deals with the program and how migrant worker subjective experiences of employment are experienced. And this is consistent with Marx's famous observation that people make their own history not under circumstances they themselves have chosen, but under the given and inherited circumstances with which they are directly confronted. Workers' embodied experiences of control, agency, and resistance, however small or seemingly insignificant, must be examined in relation to the social dynamics in which they are entrenched. So in my thesis, I discuss these constraints to workers' agency and freedom through the conceptual lenses of power and control, with a particular focus on how these operate through workers' bodies. So my discussion reveals a relationship between the policies associated with the program and workers' embodied experiences of participating in the SAWP that reproduces and solidifies what I'm not going to come back to, but I referred to in my thesis as colonial relations in the workplace and in the community. And I go into that more in detail in my thesis, but there's not really time to talk too much about that today. So there's way too much to cover right now in such a short presentation. So I'm just going to focus on one aspect that I think really helps us to understand a little bit of what I'm talking about. And that aspect has to do with housing provision within the SAWP. Because I think housing provisions in particular determine how workers' bodies are distributed in physical space. So the SAWP contract stipulates that employers must provide housing to their workers. In the case of field operations such as vineyards, orchards, and field vegetables, employer-provided housing is most often located on employers' properties and takes the form of single-sex, single-ethnicity dormitories that are comprised of communal rooms for sleeping, cooking, and bathing. So in the case of greenhouse operations, these dormitories are physically attached to the work site. So this is the context in which I did my research. So sort of like a built addition to the greenhouse or the warehouse where employees work. So Alta Cravey, who has studied internally migratory maquiladora workers in northern Mexico, has articulated how the intimate environment of the dormitory topples the binary of the public and the private, as, quote, workplace, household, and community relationships collapse into one geographical site. Consequently, even the smallest details of life are highly regulated. Housing provisions, which are incorporated into the SAWP contract, provide the same spatial collapse of private and public spheres as described by Cravey. So the state and employer forms of discipline and control that I discuss in this chapter permeate all forms of social interaction and daily social reproduction that workers undertake, whether in the workplace or at home, as these cannot be separated. So for CWSE workers, the simplest, most banal processes of daily social reproduction, what Cindy Katz refers to as the, quote, fleshy, messy, and indeterminate stuff of everyday life, occur within the realm of the agricultural production unit and fall within the scrutiny and control of employers and, I argue by extension, state officials. So activities such as cooking laundry, communicating with family members, and even forging relationships among workers and socializing in their off time, if you could call it that, often occur on company property, and it could probably be argued as well company time. So what are the consequences that this arrangement may have on workers' embodied experiences of control and discipline? So I'll discuss the SAWP living at work arrangement by discussing Foucault's examination of disciplinary power as set against Jacques Rancière's notion of the distribution of the sensible, just to hopefully clear things up by getting a little bit more complicated. So, when attempting to understand workplace discipline and control, the work of Foucault is useful as a starting point, particularly his discussion on the production of docile bodies in his book Discipline and Punish. So Foucault describes disciplinary power as, quote, a political anatomy of detail, or a modest, suspicious power that operates through individual bodies. He describes a docile body as one that, quote, may be subjected, used, transformed, and improved. Foucault illustrates how a docile body is produced through a calculated manipulation of the body's individual elements, its gestures, and its behaviors, in such a way as to create an effective machine out of individual bodies. Foucault's elaboration of disciplinary power helps to elucidate the forms of managerial discipline and control that may be enacted when the sovereign power of employers and state officials is increased, which is something I argue is the case in my SAWP. That's something that I get into more detail in my thesis. Foucault says, quote, the meticulousness of the regulations, the fussiness of the inspections, the supervision of the smallest fragment of life and of the body will soon provide, in the context of the school, the barracks, the hospital, or the workshop, an economic or technical rationality for this mystical calculus of the infinitesimal and the infinite, unquote. That wasn't my words. The disciplinary system described by Foucault could be understood as providing the overall context in which a worker's daily tasks take place. And in the context of the CWSE, may frame the context in which workers' bodies come into daily contact with their employers in the workplace, with each other in the dormitories, and even with the objects of agricultural production themselves, so the tomatoes. The meticulous attention to managerial detail that an increase in sovereign power may facilitate could work to ensure the formation of embodied work habits, which are equally attentive to detail and efficiency. In the words of Foucault, quote, a well-disciplined body forms the operational context of the slightest gesture, end quote. With regards to the production of industrial bodies, disciplinary power serves as a productive force, molding, in the words of Wolkowitz, the body of the worker to fit the production process, and conversely in developing industrial processes that could exploit the pacification and subjectification of the worker's body. Contemporary French philosopher Jacques Rancière offers a conception of bodily control that differs from Foucault's notion of disciplinary power. More than a subtle process of producing efficient and docile individual bodies through training and monitoring, Rancière articulates a notion of control that, in the words of educational theorist Tyson Lewis, is more about governing the very appearance of visibility and sayability upon which circuits of disciplinary power are drawn. So, while an understanding of disciplinary power may illuminate the process of developing docile workers through oftentimes despotic managerial processes, Rancière's notion, what he calls the distribution of the sensible, may be really useful, I think, in further elucidating how the living at work arrangement is a system of governance in which these managerial practices may take place. So, hopefully you're following. I'm going to give a quote by Rancière. Yes?
Can I ask something?
Of course.
Source?
Yeah.
Where did you get the Rancière? Was that in his distribution of sensible? In the text?
I'm not sure.
Right now?
No. I'm quoting from about 4 or 5 different books of his,
Okay.
and I don't have the actual reference right now. I think it's from his book Disagreement, which is a 1999 book, but I can't be certain at this time. I can get that for you later, though.
Okay.
So Rancière describes the distribution of the sensible as, quote, an order of bodies that defines the allocation of ways of doing, ways of being, and ways of saying, and sees that those bodies are assigned by name to a particular place and task. It is an order of the visible and the sayable that sees that a particular activity is visible and another is not. So it's my position that the construction, discipline, and control of migrant bodies, as undertaken by the state and employers through the mechanisms of the CWSE, perform the same distributive function described here by Rancière as the distribution of the sensible. And I think that in no place is this more palpable than in this SAWP living at work arrangement. So governing workers' bodies by suturing the home to the workplace ensures that individual workers' bodies are indeed assigned a particular place and a particular task from which workers are expected not to deviate. So this arrangement distributes workers' bodies in such a way that bolsters both efficient agricultural production and the exclusion of non-desired populations from integrating into Canadian communities. So the SAWP living at work arrangement transcends practices of disciplinary power associated with the rise of the enclosed workplace as described by Foucault, in which individual workers are brought together in a single place of work so they could be more easily observed. The dormitory system employed in the program guarantees that workers are subject to the gaze of employers, state officials, and indeed their fellow workers in nearly all aspects of their public and private lives. To a degree, this panoptic arrangement ensures that workers do not transgress their collectively assigned and indeed singular roles as quote-unquote workers or migrant workers. So, while the living at work arrangement has been studied in detail and actually in quite a lot of depth by feminist scholars in relation to gender mobility in the context of the live-in caregiver program, it's not really been granted the same depth of analysis in research on the seasonal agricultural workers program. So that said, CWSE workers' housing conditions are a recurring theme in the literature. The Canadian migrant justice activist group Justicia for Migrant Workers has provided some of the more in-depth descriptions of housing conditions for migrant workers. For example, in 2007, they reported on housing conditions for CWSE workers in British Columbia, and they revealed the results of over 3 years of informal inspections on housing conditions that they say ranged from, quote, moderately adequate to grossly unsuitable conditions. Now, I had some photographs I wanted to share, I just forgot them, but they are quite disturbing. The housing conditions that most workers are expected to live in. Oftentimes, you'll have, between 5 and 40 workers sharing the same room, with no place to put your belongings. So it's pretty bad, and that's what they're reporting on. So I think that reporting on housing conditions is really an important endeavor, in understanding and responding to things like health and safety risks faced by migrant workers. But in my work, I argue that the living at work arrangement is about more than just the provision of cheap housing, but housing provision is a central mechanism through which the state and the employer may facilitate the effective control of the labor process. So what does this begin to tell us about how inequality is produced and reproduced at the level of workers' bodies in their daily routines of work, friendship, and the mundane tasks of social reproduction as they take place in CWSE environments? So for this, I turn to an analysis of embodiment, performance, and agency. So I'll address a little bit more depth the question about how, and the first question I'll reiterate, how is the distribution of workers' bodies, now hopefully that it's a bit cleared up what I'm talking about when I say that, is maintained and resisted at the level of everyday encounters. So I've already talked about the first part, the distribution of bodies, but what about the level of everyday encounters? What do I mean by that? So this is the part that is more rough. Right, so I'm just kind of working through a lot of ideas that I've been thinking about for a while but haven't actually written onto the page until this presentation today. So the literature on labor agency would suggest that there is an antagonism between the conflicting forces of workplace discipline on the one hand and worker agency that shapes the development of working class subjectivities in precarious forms of employment. So this antagonism has been articulated in a variety of ways. For example, as the manner through which workers are, in the words of Nicole Constable, who works with live-in maids in Hong Kong from the Philippines, both exerting power and simultaneously being dominated by it. So Poon Nagai, who's a feminist scholar who has studied women factory workers from the Chinese countryside who work in special economic zones, so like Foxconn and those types of big factories that work on like iPhones and stuff like that. She is somebody whose work resonates for me a lot, because I find even though the scale is entirely different, she's talking about millions of workers and I'm talking about thousands of workers, there's a lot of similarities I find in what I'm finding in my data and what she sort of found in hers. So I'll mention her now. She describes this antagonism as the dialect of discipline and freedom. In other words, the balance between control and self-determination that shapes the subjective experience of employment. So for her, the everyday negotiation of discipline and autonomy is central to the formation of a working class subjectivity. And central to her position is the idea that class relations and worker subjectivity are born out of and mediated by workers embodied in everyday experiences of employment. So she discusses the formation of something she calls dagonmei. And it's a term that she uses to describe what she refers to as a new female Chinese subaltern subject that embodies this dual process of domination and resistance. She claims that the development of dagonmei marks the rise of a fluid working class consciousness not tied to class struggle or social action. So she provides evidence from her ethnographic research that she did on the factory floor and in employer-provided dormitories that collective participation in social movements is not always necessary in the formation of class consciousness. So regardless of the enormous constraints that she's talking about in her work that are arguably worse than the CWSE program, in everyday life, or unorganized workers may still operate as what she calls tactical agents in negotiating their own lives. So for me, this is a significant observation because in my research, I've made the decision to engage with workers who are not involved in community or trade union organizing. So my research participants are workers who've not complained about conditions in any formal way, have not participated in organizing protests even though they may be aware of them, and have not been involved with community or trade unionism. So often in the literature it's said that CWSE workers do not participate in overtly political organizing because they're afraid of repatriation or other forms of punishment, and it's even been said by some scholars that everyday forms of resistance are not available to workers because they're just too difficult to sustain given the enormous constraints. But having worked closely with many workers for many years, and you can see from my first story about Alberto on the truck, I had the idea coming into the research that just wasn't the full story. There was more to it. And I was interested in developing a deeper understanding of agency among migrant workers who are not politically active. So in this section, I'm starting to engage with Bourdieu's concept of habitus, as well as Irving Goffman's analysis of performance in everyday life, to shed more light on the ways in which the technologies of control and the distribution of the sensible that I've already discussed become embodied, normalized, and enacted among workers. So I'm starting to get closer and closer to Roxana, as we move on through the presentation. Bourdieu describes habitus as a system of, quote, durable, transposable dispositions that are determined by the past conditions which have produced the principle of their production. So he goes on to describe these conditions as, quote, the material conditions of existence characteristic of class condition that are constitutive of a certain type of environment, end quote. That's Bourdieu. So he describes habitus as an intentionless and regulated improvisation, a set of unconscious and collective practices that are environmentally determined, that embody social structures, and which are brought together in every social interaction. So interpersonal relationships, according to him, are never just about individual to individual relations. So to quote him, every confrontation between agents, in fact, brings together systems of dispositions, and through these habitus, all the objective structures of which they are the product, structures which are active only when embodied in a competence acquired in the course of a particular history. End quote. That's Bourdieu. So the practices and dispositions that make up habitus are learned by individuals by unconsciously imitating the actions of others. And in this way, habitus, and by extension the social structures embedded within it, are unconsciously produced and reproduced through everyday interpersonal interactions. This is Bourdieu talking. So for him, the intimate space of the home is the principal site in which this process takes place and where habitus primarily develops. This insight is particularly germane given my analysis of how migrant worker bodies are distributed in the context of the living at work arrangement. So the spatial organization of the home/workplace not only distributes workers according to their predetermined places and tasks, but the structure becomes embodied and permeates every social interaction through the production and reproduction of habitus in the workplace and the bunkhouse, potentially. So in his book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, Irving Goffman employs a dramaturgical approach to the study of everyday social encounters in which he places performance, what he calls performance, in everyday life at the center of identity formation. So Goffman's formulation of performance is intimately linked to personal agency, which I think for me it's pretty interesting. For Goffman, as for Bourdieu, social identities are both embedded and enacted in everyday contexts. So Goffman explains how when individuals express themselves in interpersonal encounters in everyday spaces, they tend to incorporate commonly held social norms into their daily interactions. Goffman emphasizes this point by stating that oftentimes everyday performances of the self tend to represent an idealized view of commonly accepted social norms that, quote, highlights the common official values of the society, end quote. So his position, understood through the lens of habitus, facilitates an understanding of identity formation which is embodied, enacted, embedded in social context, and which cannot be separated from interpersonal encounters. Now, the dramaturgical nature of performance in everyday life is particularly evident through an examination of a person's work life, because that's sort of the nexus of social life for a lot of people. Goffman discusses how the performance of one's work is often not just about completing tasks, but about dramatizing or even exaggerating the performance of those tasks. He discusses how workers often approach work in such a way that will both incorporate and attempt to epitomize that which is expected both by the employer and by larger societal norms. So in other words, workers will provide the employer with whatever the worker thinks the employer wants to see, simply because that's what's expected. So in this sense, workers' deferential behavior in the workplace may be seen as, quote, an expressive rejuvenation and reaffirmation of the moral values of the community, or in this case, the structures of control and discipline that permeate the SAWP. So workers' personal histories of migration and employment in the context of their participation in the program, I think, necessarily shape their understandings of what is expected of them in Canadian society. So a Goffman-esque position would hold that over time, workers learn to effectively perform these expectations in their daily interactions with employers, state officials, their colleagues, and even local Canadians. So while migrant workers' personal identities may incorporate many different aspects of their lives, for example, as parents, as spouses, as even entrepreneurs in their home country, the performance of their public selves while they're here in Canada is primarily shaped by the experiences of what is expected of them as workers exclusively. So it's been suggested in the literature that there's a perception by CWSE employers that migrant farm workers are more deferent. They're just more deferent than Canadian workers. And this is actually a crucial element in the continuation, success, and use of guest worker programs in Canada. It follows, I think, that the performance of deference must be experienced by workers themselves as a vital component of their daily lives. So for me, it's really surprising that the experience of performing deference in Canadian guest worker programs is underanalyzed in the literature, both empirically and theoretically.
Could you explain deference?
Yeah, so deference would have to do with like accommodating, for example, to the employer's wishes, right? So not complaining in the workplace and just kind of going about your work, in spite of exploitative conditions, especially. So a dramaturgical and embodied approach to understanding workers' everyday interactions may provide a lens through which to understand how the performance of deference, not to mention other things like resilience and resistance, operates within the program. So Goffman, I think, provides some conceptual tools to help facilitate an analysis of how, for example, deference may be performed by workers and possibly over-communicated through a process that he calls negative idealization. So according to him, workers may have a tendency to downplay their status in their performances at work, or at least the perception of their own status in front of employers or other authority figures. So in general, it follows, I think, from my data that migrant workers may develop a collective capacity to perform in public the gestures and movements associated with a deferential subjectivity. Through relations with employers, fellow co-workers, state officials, local Canadians, SAWP workers eventually come to embody the broad frames within which they may improvise their so-called proper roles. So it's thus through lived experience, trial and error, interpersonal interactions, those types of things, and everyday encounters, that workers learn the conduct appropriate to the distribution of migrant bodies discussed previously. So it's within this frame that workers develop daily practices that can only be accounted for in relation to the social conditions in which they are produced and learned. So I think that if we follow through with this argument, it stands to reason that among workers themselves there must be a commonly held form of expression, or what Bourdieu might call habitus, which is produced in relation to the program's particular allocation of the sensible. This is not a set of behavioral practices particular to any ethnic group, be it Mexican or Jamaican or whatever, as some employers may believe, but rather more appropriately described as a kind of intangible style of collective conduct or set of regulated improvisations, to use the words of Bourdieu, which workers learn as a matter of navigating the complex structure and life of the SAWP. So this idea is that through their participation in the program, workers eventually develop an expertise in the use of a discrete migrant worker vernacular of survival, common to the group. Goffman describes this process as workers developing the command of a common idiom, which is basically enacted through the performance of expressions and movements that are exercised with very little calculation or forethought. So in my context, I think, of my work, the development and acquisition of this vernacular is a result of specific technologies of control and surveillance that establish a form of body discipline that facilitates its normalization. Right? For example, the process of self-monitoring that accompanies relentless workplace practices that specify exact body posture and that require, in the words of Ewa Ong, tedious repetition of the same finger, eye, and limb movements, often for hours on end, ensures that workers gain complete fluency in the accepted guidelines of conduct. So, once a worker becomes proficient in the guidelines of conduct, the expected presentation of a deferential self becomes an embodied and implicit act, a daily improvisation composed of precise yet elusive movements and gestures meant to communicate not only deference but also strength, fortitude, resilience, skill, all of those things that are expected of workers. These daily improvisations that make up the performance of a worker's self are not necessarily performed consciously. As to quote Goffman, we all act better than we know how. So I think here he's prefiguring, because Goffman is prior to Michael Polanyi, Polanyi's what he would later describe as tacit knowledge, right? So knowledge that may be possible to act on, but that we don't necessarily even know that we have or even possible for us to express. So while workers may be aware of their everyday forms of oppression and domination that govern their everyday lives, they may be less aware of their active participation in their performed routines of maintaining the accepted standard. So the development of commonly expressed practices does not require that individuals communicate explicit intentions to each other. Rather, group identity is grounded in the, quote, diffuse, uncoordinated features of thought implicit in the ways of being common to a particular period and particular popular environment, and that's to quote Gramsci. So the common experience of being part of a group or class is enacted. This is a key sort of idea, through familiar patterns of collective conduct. It follows that the sustainability of the distribution of migrant worker bodies, as described earlier, does not necessarily imply passivity on the part of workers. On the contrary, it requires that individual workers overtly perform patterns of acceptable conduct in everyday life. In the context of the SAWP, individual workers carry with them, in the form of dispositions, to quote Bourdieu, the marks of present and past experiences of migration, mistreatment, abuse, survival, and resistance. It's my position that workers as a group carry with them and to varying degrees perform in their daily lives the implicit understanding of quote-unquote knowing one's place and quote staying there. And that's Bourdieu. So just to conclude this section, I think that in the context of the SAWP, what Goffman is describing here can be characterized as an important collective survival strategy. So the dynamics that must be enacted through individual workers' bodies and everyday settings in order to ensure the proper distribution of the sensible are enacted through a collectively recognized performance that serves to maintain, of course, an equilibrium that is acceptable to employers, but it also basically helps to keep workers out of trouble. So team members must collectively cooperate if they are to maintain a certain commonly understood characterization of the situation in the presence of their audience, in other words, Canadians, employers. This is not to say that other forms of individual agency or resistance, such as confronting the boss about exploitative conditions, don't occur. In fact, they occur all the time. But the forms of resistance available to individual workers not associated with a collective organizing are limited, and more often than not geared towards survival and maintaining a sense of dignity, rather than as a way to address systemic forms of oppression. So I think it would be unfair to categorize workers either as just passive and oppressed victims or as self-determined subjects resisting discipline. While personal and everyday forms of resistance may do little to alter the overall structural relationship, they may go a long way to providing a sense of satisfaction for workers on a symbolic level and may facilitate workers finding and developing their own voice. And I'm coming to the final section. So for the remainder of today's presentation, I'll focus on my second question, which is, in general, what does it mean to engage in decolonizing pedagogy with migrant workers? And in particular, how can the use of a theater-based pedagogy facilitate so-called emancipatory goals? So bear in mind that from now on, when I'm referring to performance, I'm not really referring to the way it was engaged with by Goffman, but I'm sort of referring to it now more overtly in a theatrical or dramatic way. And this brings me to Roxana, actually, and Roxana's class that I took with her. For those of you who came in late, it was, what was it called? I don't know, I had it written down, but it was a class I took with Roxana a couple years ago. One reading in particular stuck out for me in that class, and it was written by Roxana herself. It's a chapter on embodied learning that I think is probably her most recent publication. It's from a 2010 book. And this is what she had to say. This is a Roxana quote. For me, the notion of decolonization dissolves the boundaries between self and collectivity, between the individual and the systemic. It interrogates how we, as individuals living within and being part of collectivities, reproduce and sustain systems of oppression. We reproduce oppression through normalized patterns of behavior that have been developed over time, that have become natural, automatic, and unconscious actions and ways of being in the world. It is indeed the encounters of bodies, not only of intellect, that give dynamism to the process of teaching and learning. As we engage in critical teaching and bring our activism to work, this dynamism is what excites us at the same time that it makes us sick when we go against the grain. That's a quote from Roxana. In this chapter, Roxana is exploring the possibility of facilitating, through embodied learning, a rupture from habitus. This whole idea of rupture, I think, is going to be pretty central to my work. Like I said, this is a work in progress. I'm sort of playing with this idea now. So a rupture from habitus and from performing preordained, socially accepted roles in interpersonal encounters. That's Roxana. So now I'll talk a little bit about the type of theater that I engaged with in my field work. So the style of theater that I most associate myself with is called the theater of the oppressed. I don't know how much in detail, I don't know how much Jamie knows about it, but I know other people in the room know quite a bit about it. I'll describe it just briefly. It was originally developed by Brazilian theater director Gustavo Wow, who was a contemporary of Paulo Freire, and it's often described as sort of the artistic cousin to the pedagogy of the oppressed. So the theater of the oppressed can be described as a system of games and activities that may offer an opportunity for educators to engage in a disruption of what, in the words of Bell Hooks, quote, that objectification that is so necessary in a culture of domination, by way of a return to a state of embodiment in order to deconstruct the way power has been traditionally orchestrated inside and outside of traditional educational settings. Roxana's notion of embodied learning is structured within a notion of decolonization, which includes enactments of resistance, questioning, reclamation, and transformation of ruling ideas, which have become embedded in our very bodies and our very behaviors. Roxana's ideas echo central elements of the theater of the oppressed in general, and the practice of image theater in particular, which is the technique of theater of the oppressed that I use the most in my field work. Boal describes image theater as a technique that attempts to uncover what he terms a society's rituals. And his understanding of rituals, I think, is very similar to Habitus, which he says are expressed through gestures and signs. And he describes these gestures and signs as, quote, visual expressions of the oppressions to be found at the heart of society. So it's these visual expressions that you're actually playing with when you're doing theater of the oppressed work. So theater of the oppressed techniques like image theater, image theater is basically where participants mold themselves into static images or tableaus that are then collectively discussed and analyzed, and I think can perhaps reveal hidden aspects of gestures and movements through what Boal calls the multiple mirror of the gaze of others. So it's basically the idea of a group of participants looking at the same tableau, offering their thoughts and feelings, and evoking whatever their imaginations produce around that image or tableau. And these are often based on people's real life experiences, right? So it's really sort of like this really dynamic process. So by discovering, analyzing, and imagining alternatives to social rituals and personal habits, theater of the oppressed may offer a creative structure for teaching against the grain of social convention by pinpointing alternatives to hegemonic practices through identity formation and personal or social reinvention. My goal was pretty much to create an aesthetic space where dialogue and self-actualization were effected through the body. And this brings me back full circle to Jacques Rancière. So he's sort of interesting because he helps me to think through the ways in which workers' bodies are distributed, but also the notion of rupture is really central to Rancière, not just Roxana. So, Roxana is talking about rupture of habitus. Rancière is talking about a rupture of the distribution of the sensible, right? So there's two different elements that are sort of playing here. One is the rupture of certain behavioral patterns, and one is the rupture in the status quo itself. So like Roxana, rupture is central to Rancière's notion of emancipatory education. So it's his position, this is Rancière, that there is already a horizontal equality that is occurring in the present moment. So he's very critical of a vertical approach to consciousness raising that's often associated with popular education, whereby an external critical educator comes in and raises the consciousness of the learner. Okay? For him, learners or participants, and in my case, workers, are already aware of their oppression, and they don't need necessarily to be taught that they're oppressed or reminded of it. Right? Equality is not something that needs to be fought for in the distant future, but rather exists in the here and now, and merely needs to be demanded by those who are perceived not to have it. So it's sort of a different way of approaching emancipatory education. For Rancière, demanding equality occurs through a dispute.
I'm losing my opportunity to be here. I'm in class. So
Okay.
Here in spirit.
Hey, Angie.
It's fantastically interesting.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks. So demanding equality occurs through a dispute or a rupture in the distribution of the sensible. So in other words, for him, a process of emancipation means involving those who are not considered eligible to speak, or in my case, migrant farm workers, in taking the, quote, time to occupy the space of public discussions and take on the identity of a deliberative citizen, end quote. This rupture signals the advent of the political and in turn also the subjectivation of democratic subjects. So the workshop and performance component of my fieldwork attempted to challenge the distribution of the sensible among a community of migrant farm workers by removing, however temporarily, participants from their domestic space of work and the bunkhouse, and offered them the time to be deliberative and creative in ways that are denied to them, usually. So inspired by both Roxana and Rancière, my attempt has been to mold the research process into an artistic practice that can intervene in the general distribution of what are considerable acceptable forms of ways and doing for migrant workers. Specifically, I attempted to design a research arena in which participants were invited to enter and temporarily shed their identities as workers and to create a space without specific preconditions and to create a community of aesthetic play. So the assumption that I'm making here when I talk about rupture, whether it's a rupture with habitus or a rupture with the status quo, is that the common vernacular that I discussed earlier when I was talking about Bourdieu and Goffman, the one that I claimed is produced through living and working in the context of the SAWP, is not totalizing, right? And that there are always ways of splintering it, right? So that's a key, because I think oftentimes habitus can be seen as very sort of fatalistic and there not being these sort of entry points. What I'm searching for are precisely those entry points. While my data does indeed point toward a myriad of ways that workers perform a set vernacular that maintains and reproduces the status quo, there are a lot of other examples of how these gestures may be upset in small ways that may seem insignificant to an outsider. I'll just give one example from my data. Near the beginning of the theatrical workshop phase, I began to explore the concept of action with my group of research participants. So this workshop is attended by 4 migrant workers from Mexico, each of whom was employed in the tomato and cucumber greenhouse sector. So there was Ignacio, who was 62 years old and had 20 years in the program. Jeronimo, who was 47 and had 11 years in the program. Jorge was 45, 11 years in the program. And Marcos, who was 26, and it was his first year in the program. And that's another thing, is I had a very wide range of experiences. People who were in the program for 20, 21 years, some who was their first year, some who were in the middle, women, men, all sorts of I think a very representative snapshot. So we began our examination by exploring through physical movement what actions workers execute in their everyday lives, and through a follow-up discussion, how much control workers felt they could exercise over their daily actions. Each participant was invited to demonstrate an action to share on the stage for their fellow participants. On this day, 4 participants were in attendance, and each chose to present an action from their work in the greenhouse industry, such as picking tomatoes or tying the vines of tomato plants. My first observation of these workers' presentations was how detailed participants' physical movements were, and how quickly and easily workers were able to set the scene for the audience. None of my research participants had any acting training or experience, yet each of them seemed able to communicate very complex ideas and scenarios through their bodies with ease and precision, which is fairly unusual. When I asked why they thought this may be the case, I asked them about this. I said, well, you guys are doing a really bang-up job here. Why is that? All of the participants agreed that the actions they performed on the stage were examples of movements that they each carry out in their jobs in every moment of every single day. For this activity, each participant decided to demonstrate an action that each described as so repetitive as to be etched into their very genes. So these were movements that their bodies could never forget. In the words of Marcos, we do these activities all day, every day. These actions are impossible to forget. When I started working, I knew nothing. But when I saw the greenhouse, and at this point he made a gesture with his arm indicating the sheer magnitude of the greenhouse operation, I knew that I would soon be an expert because I'd have so much practice. It became clear from our discussion after each individual's presentation that participants spent a lot of time considering the ways in which their bodies move at work. My initial reaction as a facilitator was to comment to the participants on how workers seem to have very little control over the repetitive actions they perform in the workplace. I made the comment here that there may be actions in our lives that we are more able to improvise or have creative control over, and some, like repetitive workplace actions, over which we have very little control. So Marcos interrupted in disagreement. which is something that I encourage throughout my fieldwork. So he explained how the formation of repetitive workplace movements was indeed a creative enterprise, actually, and not just the unconscious performance of tacitly learned movements. So it was something that he was actually aware of, which took me by surprise. He told us that creative action can and does happen in the workplace. He provided the example of how he has learned to work with one hand by holding his scissors with 2 fingers and holding 3 tomatoes with his other 3 fingers. This makes his work more efficient, and he emphasized that he created this system all on his own. So in total agreement with Marcos, the other 3 participants discussed how each worker must consider ways in which they can make their work-related bodily movements the most efficient possible for very good reasons. One is to avoid a confrontation with the employer, and also to prevent injury. Participants' comments on how individual creativity factors in the performance of repetitive actions at work, I think, reveal something about how workers do express agency at the micro level of their experiences at work. That's just one example. Jorge in particular discussed how workers have a lot of power in the workplace, and he commented on how the ways in which workers control their bodies is tightly bound to the success of the agricultural enterprise. He says, quote, "It is the worker with his own hands who has the most control." Right? So it's a sort of a very sort of embodied understanding of control with his own hands. So you can see just from this one example how workers are being creative in their bodies and deliberative in their reflection during these workshops. And I think that this may demonstrate that participation in these workshops can be understood as perhaps even a form of rebellion, however small. So by creating images, discussing alternatives, and delivering a public performance before an audience of peers represent both a rupture with habitus and a rupture with the distribution of the sensible. Migrant farm workers, as non-citizens relegated to the furthest margins of the labor market, indeed relegated to their workplaces and nowhere else, are just not supposed to be making art, period. The workshops and the ultimate performance of a collectively created play, almost regardless of the content, may be seen as an act of subject formation. Done properly, perhaps, it is not just a process of imitating or regurgitating acceptable gestures and vernacular, but is a productive process of dismantling political assemblages, however modest this disassembling may be. I'm going to end with some final thoughts on the epistemological and ontological implications of my work, something I was talking to you before the presentation. Something I've been thinking about recently. As a theater practitioner working in community settings, the epistemological underpinnings of my work I've always thought to be fairly clear. Epistemologically, my work encompasses 2 main objectives. One is prioritizing lived experience, and the second is finding new and embodied ways of accessing tacit knowledge, right? Which is a big challenge when you're actually talking about accessing tacit knowledge. That actually creates a very sort of challenging epistemological process, right? How are you going to do that? And I've always found that incorporating an embodied aspect to my research has been an interesting way of engaging with tacit knowledge. But the ontological implications have always been more elusive to me. But I think my supervisor is sort of pushing me to think a bit about that right now. So much of the literature and practice of popular forms of art and performance have attempted to graft to artistic practice the desire for a material production of political efficacy. That's what I'm calling it. And this, I think, would be my critique of what was expected of our union employers back in that second story that I told. The arts in popular education have been traditionally evaluated according to their efficacy in the production of a particular set of social outcomes. In our case, getting union cards signed. But what is intriguing to me is to what extent artistic engagement is a value in and of itself, regardless of concrete social outcomes. What if it's the very immateriality of dramatic or theatrical performance? In other words, its seeming frivolity that poses the deepest threat to the demands of capitalist production. When migrant workers participate in theatrical creation and performance, this is, in a sense, a direct confrontation to their stated purpose and identity as economically valuable agricultural workers. In a strict ontological sense, it's been said, and I'm thinking of, I don't know, for those of you who study this stuff, Peggy Phelan, she's like a feminist scholar in performance studies. And she talks about how performance is by its very nature non-reproducible and immaterial. And in this sense, if you think about performance in that way, workers' participation has no economic value whatsoever. And in this sense, their participation is totally economically superfluous, and as such, slightly radical, I like to think. More than that, workers are performing for each other. So it's not just me and another worker. They're in a group of people, right? They're performing for each other, and then they're as participants in the workshop setting, but then they're also performing to an audience of fellow migrant workers, which is something I facilitated as well. In this context, workers become the objects of the spectator's gaze in the workshop and on the stage. The body of the worker as social or political agent thus comes to be seen and experienced through the appearance of the worker as something other than just worker. They come to be seen as artists, as performers, as community members, as creators, or something I like to think about just as flaneurs, right? I ask, to what extent does this reimagining of subject positions facilitate the restoration of the worker as embodied subject?